The morning rush was in full swing at Grand Central Terminal. Thousands of people hurried through the massive hall, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Everyone seemed to be in their own world, checking phones, grabbing coffee, rushing to catch trains. Nobody paid much attention to the man in the corner who looked just like everyone else. He stood about 6 feet tall with salt and pepper hair peeking out from under a plain black baseball cap. His leather jacket had seen better days, with small scuffs on the elbows and a worn spot near the zipper. His jeans were faded blue, the kind you might find at any department store. His sneakers looked comfortable, but nothing fancy. To anyone passing by, seemed like just another regular guy, heading somewhere important. But this wasn't just any regular guy. This was David Park, one of the richest people in America. His company had revolutionized how people shop online, making him worth over $2 billion. Yet here he was, dressed like he worked at the local hardware store, and loving every minute of it. David had started doing this about 3 years ago. Once a month, he would leave his penthouse apartment, change into his most ordinary clothes, and spend the day walking around the city like a normal person. No bodyguards, no fancy cars, no assistants following him around. Just him and the city he loved, but rarely got to experience anymore. He called these his freedom days. Days when he could grab a hot dog from a street vendor without someone taking his picture. Days when he could sit on a park bench and watch people without anyone recognizing him. Days when he could remember what life felt like before the money and fame changed everything. Today felt different, though. As he walked through the terminal, he heard something that made him slow down. Music. Someone was playing guitar near the big information booth in the center of the hall. The sound was beautiful, but also sad somehow. It reminded him of something from long ago, something he had almost forgotten. He followed the sound and found a small crowd gathered around a teenage boy with an old acoustic guitar. The kid couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. His clothes were clean but clearly secondhand. His guitar case was open on the ground with a few dollar bills and some coins scattered inside. Not much for what David could tell was really talented playing. The boy was playing a classical piece, but he had given it his own twist. His fingers moved across the strings with confidence, creating a melody that seemed to float above all the noise of the busy terminal. Some people stopped to listen for a minute or two, dropped $1 in the case, and moved on. But David found himself staying, drawn in by something he couldn't quite name. The music reminded him of his childhood. His grandmother had played piano, and she used to tell him that music was the language of the heart. She said it could say things that words never could. As he listened to this young musician, he felt something stir inside him that had been quiet for years. When the song ended, most of the small crowd applauded politely and walked away. The boy looked into his guitar case, and David could see the disappointment on his face. The kid had played his heart out for maybe $8 or $9. In the time it took him to play that song, David's investments had probably earned him more money than this talented teenager would see in months. The boy started packing up his guitar, clearly getting ready to leave. That's when David noticed something that made his chest tighten. Behind the teenager, sitting quietly against the wall, was an older woman with kind eyes and worn hands. She was watching the boy with the love that only a mother could have. Her clothes were neat but old, and David could tell she was probably working multiple jobs just to get by. The woman caught David looking and gave him a small, tired smile. Kind of smile that said she was proud of her son, but worried about their future. David had seen that same look on his own mother's face many years ago. Back when they struggled to pay rent and wondered where their next meal would come from, without really thinking about it. David walked over to the public piano that sat nearby. It was one of those community pianos that cities put in public spaces, hoping to bring a little music and joy to people's daily lives. Most of the time, kids would bang on the keys or someone would play chopsticks, but occasionally, someone with real talent would sit down and create magic. David hadn't played piano in public for over 20 years. Sure, he still played at home sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, and the weight of running a massive company felt too heavy. But that was different. That was private. This would be putting himself out there in a way that felt both terrifying and exciting. A few people noticed him walking toward the piano. There was something about the way he moved, confident but not showy, that made them curious. Maybe it was the way he rolled up his sleeves before sitting down, or how he adjusted the bench with the familiarity of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The teenage guitarist had stopped packing and was watching too. Something about this ordinary-looking man had caught his attention. Maybe it was the way David's hands hovered over the keys for just a moment, like he was deciding whether to go through with whatever he was thinking. David's fingers found the keys, and he played a single, clear note. Then another. The sound was perfect, ringing out across the busy terminal with a clarity that made heads turn. He started with something simple, a melody that most people would recognize but couldn't quite place. It was the kind of tune that made you think of movies or memories you couldn't quite grab hold of, but even those first few notes were played with a skill that was obvious to anyone listening. This wasn't someone who occasionally played at family gatherings. This was someone who understood music at a level that few people ever reach. The young guitarist stopped packing completely now, his case forgotten on the ground. His mother sat up straighter, her tired eyes suddenly alert and interested. Other people began to gather, drawn by something they sensed was about to be special. David let the simple melody build slowly, adding layers of harmony with his left hand while his right hand danced through notes that seemed to sparkle in the air. The music wasn't loud or flashy. It was gentle and inviting, like someone sharing a secret that was too beautiful to keep to themselves. More people stopped walking. Businessmen in expensive suits found themselves standing next to college students with backpacks. A woman pushing a baby stroller parked nearby so her infant could hear the music. An elderly man with a cane made his way closer, a smile spreading across his weathered face. David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The pure joy of making music for people who needed it, not because they paid for tickets or expected a performance, but simply because beauty had found them in an unexpected moment. This was why he had fallen in love with music as a child, and why he had never completely let it go, even when business consumed most of his life. The melody continued to grow, and David could feel the crowd growing with it. But he kept his eyes closed, lost in the music and the memories it was awakening. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt completely present in the moment. Not thinking about stock prices or board meetings or the 100 decisions waiting for him back at the office. Just a man, a piano, and a melody that was about to change everything. What started as a simple tune began to transform into something extraordinary. David's fingers moved across the keys with the grace of a master craftsman, each note perfectly placed and timed. The melody that had begun so gently was now growing, stronger, more complex, like a flower blooming in fast motion. The crowd around the piano was getting bigger by the minute. Word was spreading through the terminal in that mysterious way that news travels in busy places. People were pulling out their phones, some to record the music, others to text friends about what they were witnessing. But most just stood there, completely absorbed in the sounds flowing from this ordinary-looking man. A security guard who had been making his rounds stopped in his tracks when he heard the music. He was supposed to keep people moving, make sure nobody lingered too long in any one spot, but something about this performance made him forget his duties for a moment. He found himself leaning against a pillar, listening with the same wonder as everyone else. The teenage guitarist was still standing there with his mouth slightly open, his guitar case forgotten at his feet. He had been playing music for years, ever since his mother scraped together enough money to buy him that old guitar from a pawn shop. He thought he understood what good music sounded like, but this was different. This was like watching someone speak a language he had been trying to learn his whole life, but hearing it spoken perfectly for the first time. His mother had moved closer too, drawn by the music like everyone else. She worked 2 jobs to support them both, cleaning offices at night and serving coffee during the day. Music was one of the few joys in their difficult life, and she could tell that what they were hearing was special. Very special. David transitioned into a more complex section of his improvised piece. His left hand was playing a steady rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the busy terminal, while his right hand wove melodies that danced and played above it. The music told a story without words, painting pictures in the minds of everyone listening. A businessman who had been Rushing to catch his train, found himself slowing down, then stopping completely. He was supposed to be in a meeting in 20 minutes, but somehow that seemed less important now. The music was reminding him of something he had forgotten in all his hurrying through life. When was the last time he had stopped to really listen? To anything beautiful? A young mother with 2 small children had been struggling to keep them quiet and moving toward their platform. But when the music reached them, her kids stopped fussing and started listening too. Her 3-year-old daughter began swaying to the rhythm, and her 5-year-old son asked in a whisper why the music was making him feel happy and sad at the same time. The mother didn't have an answer for that question, but she understood what her son meant. There was something about this music that touched places in the heart that had been closed off by the daily rush of life. It was beautiful, but it also carried a weight that spoke of deep experiences and emotions. David's eyes were still closed as he played, but he could sense the growing crowd around him. He could feel their energy, their attention, their hunger for something real in a world that often felt fake and rushed. This was what he had missed most about his life before the money and fame, the connection, the sharing of something meaningful with people who needed it. The melody shifted again, becoming more personal somehow. David was drawing from memories now, from experiences that had shaped him over the years. There were notes that spoke of childhood, wonder, or others that carried the weight of loss and disappointment. There were sections that rang with the joy of success, but also quieter moments that whispered of loneliness and the price of achievement. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes pushed her way gently through the crowd to get closer. Had been a music teacher for 40 years before retiring, and she knew talent when she heard it. But this wasn't just talent. This was artistry of the highest level. She found herself wondering who this man was and where he had learned to play like this. A group of college students had gathered near the back of the crowd. They had been on their way to class, but now they were completely absorbed in the music. One of them, a music major, was trying to figure out what piece this was, but slowly realizing that it might be entirely improvised. That thought sent chills down her spine. To improvise at this level in front of a crowd took not just skill, but courage and deep musical understanding. The music continued to build, becoming more dramatic and powerful. David's whole body was involved now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, his face showing the emotion that the music was pulling from somewhere deep inside him. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead, not from effort, but from the intensity of what he was feeling and expressing. A janitor who had been mopping floors nearby stopped his work completely. He set his mop aside and moved closer to listen. He had grown up in a house where his grandmother played old gospel songs on a beat-up piano, and he recognized the same kind of soul in this music. It didn't matter that this was classical or jazz or whatever you wanted to call it. What mattered was that it came from somewhere real. The crowd was now 3 or 4 deep around the piano. With more people joining every minute, someone had started taking video, and within moments, phones were appearing everywhere. But unlike most public recordings, these weren't being done for social media attention. People seemed to understand that they were witnessing something rare and wanted to capture it to remember later. A police officer, who had been called about the crowd forming, was making his way through the terminal. He had expected to find some kind of disturbance that needed to be broken up. Instead, he found the most peaceful crowd he had ever seen. Nobody was pushing or shouting. Everyone was just listening, completely absorbed in the music flowing from the piano. David began to transition into what felt like the final movement of his improvised piece. The music became more urgent, more emotional. It was as if all the themes he had introduced were coming together into something larger and more meaningful than any single melody could be. The teenage guitarist felt tears starting to form in his eyes, though he couldn't explain why. The music was showing him possibilities he had never imagined. It was making him understand that music wasn't just about playing notes correctly or even playing them beautifully. It was about reaching into yourself and sharing something true with the world. His mother saw the tears in her son's eyes and felt her own heart swelling with emotion. She had always known her boy was talented, but seeing how this stranger's music was affecting him made her understand that music might be more than just a hobby for them. Maybe it could be a way forward, a path to something better. The businessman who had missed his train was no longer worried about his meeting, was thinking about his daughter, who had begged him to come here at her school concert last month. Had been too busy, had promised to make the next one. But standing here, feeling what music could do to a room full of strangers, he realized what he had missed. As David's improvisation reached its crescendo, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. Even people who weren't part of the crowd had stopped talking, sensing that something special was happening nearby. The music filled every corner of the vast space, transforming a place of transit and hurry into something that felt almost sacred. And then, just as the music reached its most powerful moment, David opened his eyes and looked directly into the crowd. For the first time since he had started playing, he saw the faces of the people who had been listening.
Ow.
And what he saw there would change everything. When David opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd, his fingers almost stumbled on the keys. The sea of faces staring back at him was unlike anything he had expected. There was something in their expressions that took his breath away. It wasn't just appreciation or curiosity. It was deeper than that. It was as if his music had reached into each person and touched something they had forgotten was there. But then, the third row of people, he saw a face that made his heart skip a beat. A woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail was staring at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. Her hand was pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with what looked like shock and recognition. For a moment, David's playing faltered. Just for a second, but long enough for the woman to notice. She pushed gently through the crowd, moving closer to the piano, her eyes never leaving his face. As she got nearer, David felt a rush of memories flooding back, memories he had tried to bury for almost 25 years. This was Lisa, his college girlfriend, the woman he had planned to marry before life pulled them in different directions. The last person he had written music for, before business consumed his world and music became something he only did alone late at night when the weight of success felt too heavy to bear. The melody he had been playing began to shift, almost without his conscious control. His fingers found notes that he hadn't played in decades, weaving together fragments of a song he had written for her during their senior year. It was a piece he had never finished, never shared with anyone else, never even written down. It had lived only in his memory and in late-night moments when he wondered what might have been. Lisa recognized the melody immediately. She had only heard it once, on a spring evening in their tiny apartment near campus, when David had played it for her on his old keyboard. He had been embarrassed by it then, calling it silly and unfinished. But she had loved it, had asked him to play it again and again. It was the soundtrack to the happiest time of her life. The crowd sensed something extraordinary was happening, even if they didn't understand what. The music had become intensely personal, charged with emotion that seemed to connect directly to everyone listening. Phone cameras were recording, but people were being respectful about it. Sensing they were witnessing something private and profound, Lisa was close enough to the piano now that David could see the tears on her face clearly. She mouthed his name, so quietly that even people standing next to her couldn't hear it. But David saw it, and for the first time in 25 years, he felt like the young man he used to be, before money and responsibility changed everything about his life. The businessman who had missed his train was watching this interaction with fascination. He couldn't hear what the woman had said, but he could see the recognition passing between her and the pianist. This wasn't just a random street performance anymore. This was something much more personal and meaningful. The teenage guitarist was completely absorbed in watching David's hands on the keys. The music had become even more complex and emotional. He could tell that the pianist was drawing from some deep well of feeling. This was what he wanted his own music to do someday, to mean something, to connect with people, to tell stories that mattered. His mother was watching the woman who was crying, and her heart went out to her. She recognized the look on the woman's face because she had felt it herself. The shock of encountering someone from your past when you least expected it. The flood of memories and emotions that came with it. David began to play louder. Not because he wanted to show off, but because the emotion was demanding it. The unfinished song he had written for Lisa was completing itself, right there in front of hundreds of strangers. The notes he had never been able to find 25 years ago were flowing out of him now, as if they had been waiting all this time for the right moment. Lisa moved even closer to the piano. And now she was standing right at the edge of the crowd. Just a few feet from David, other people noticed her and could see that she was somehow connected to what was happening. Some stepped aside to give her space, sensing that she belonged there in a way they didn't. The elderly music teacher who had pushed through the crowd earlier was watching with tears in her own eyes. In all her years of teaching and listening to music, she had rarely seen such raw emotion being expressed through performance. Well, this wasn't just technical skill, though. That was clearly exceptional. This was a man playing his heart out, sharing something deeply personal with the world. David's eyes met Lisa's again, and this time he didn't look away. As he played, he saw flashes of their life together reflected in her face. Late nights studying, together in the library, weekend trips to the mountains. The morning she had made him breakfast and told him she loved him for the first time. The fight they had when he got accepted to business school on the other coast. The tearful goodbye at the airport when they both promised to stay in touch, knowing somehow that they wouldn't. The music was telling their story now, and Lisa could hear it all. The joy of young love, the pain of separation, the years of wondering what might have been. But there was something else in the melody too, something new that hadn't been there in the original song. There was wisdom and sadness, and a kind of hard-won understanding about life that only came with experience. A security supervisor had arrived to check on the crowd. But like everyone else, he found himself drawn into the music. He had been expecting to disperse a gathering that was blocking traffic flow, but instead he found the most orderly and peaceful crowd he had ever seen in the terminal. Nobody was pushing or complaining about being late. Everyone was simply listening. Some people in the crowd were starting to recognize David's face. In the age of social media and constant news, it was hard for someone as wealthy and prominent as he was to stay completely anonymous. Whispers began to spread through the outer edges of the crowd as people looked him up on their phones. "Is that really him?" someone whispered. "The tech guy? The billionaire? What's he doing here?" But even as recognition spread, the crowd remained respectful. There was something about the music and the obvious emotional weight of the moment that kept people from treating this like a celebrity sighting. It felt sacred somehow. It's like they were witnessing something that was bigger than fame or money. David could sense the recognition spreading through the crowd, but he didn't care anymore. For the first time in years, he was being completely honest about who he was and what he felt. The music was his truth, and Lisa's presence was making him remember parts of himself he had thought were lost forever. The song was building toward something, a climax that David could feel approaching but couldn't quite predict. Lisa seemed to sense it too, because she moved even closer to the piano. Close enough now that she could have reached out and touched the keys. The teenage guitarist watched in amazement as the music reached heights of complexity and emotion that he had never imagined possible. This wasn't just performance anymore. This was like watching someone bare their soul in public, using music as their language. And then, just as the song reached its most intense moment, David did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He began to sing, not loudly, and not in a showy way, but in a voice that was raw with emotion and years of unexpressed feeling. The words he sang weren't elaborate or poetic. They were simple and honest, about love found and lost, about choices made and chances missed, about the things we carry with us through all the years of our lives. And as he sang, looking directly at Lisa, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath, because everyone there could see that they weren't just watching a performance anymore. They were witnessing something real and profound and life-changing, something that would matter long after the music ended. The moment David started singing, something magical happened in that crowded terminal. His voice wasn't perfect in the way a professional singer's might be, but it carried something much more powerful than technical skill. It carried 25 years of buried emotion, of regret and longing and love that had never quite died. The words he sang were simple. It's almost like a conversation set to music. He sang about morning coffee and shared dreams, about promises made under starlit skies, about the way someone's laugh could light up an entire room. But mostly he sang about missing someone so much that success felt empty, that all the money in the world couldn't fill the space they had left behind. Lisa stood frozen, her hands still pressed to her mouth, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. These weren't just random lyrics. They were memories. Their memories transformed into song. David was singing about the time they had gotten caught in the rain and ended up dancing on the empty campus quad. About the morning she had surprised him with pancakes shaped like musical notes. About the last conversation they had when they both tried to pretend that saying goodbye wasn't breaking their hearts. The crowd around them had grown silent in a way that felt almost sacred, even in a place as busy as Grand Central Terminal, where thousands of people passed through every hour. This moment had created its own bubble of peace and attention. People who had been rushing to catch trains found themselves rooted in place, completely absorbed in what they were witnessing. The teenage guitarist felt like he was watching a master class in how music could be used to communicate the deepest human emotions. This wasn't just entertainment. It was confession, apology, and love letter, all rolled into one performance. He glanced at his mother and saw that she was crying too, though he doubted she even knew why. A woman in a business suit who had been checking her phone constantly throughout her morning commute had put it away completely. She was thinking about her own college boyfriend, the one she had let slip away when career opportunities pulled them to different cities. She had told herself it was the practical choice, the smart choice. But listening to David's song made her wonder if she had given up something irreplaceable. The businessman who had missed his train was recording the performance on his phone, but not for social media. He wanted to send it to his wife, to remind her why he had fallen in love with her 20 years ago. The raw honesty in David's voice was making him think about all the times he had been too busy or too tired to tell the people he loved how much they meant to him. As more people in the crowd looked David up on their phones, the whispers of recognition grew stronger. But instead of changing the atmosphere, knowing who he was seemed to make the moment even more powerful. Here was one of the most successful businessmen in the world, someone who could buy anything he wanted, and he was using his platform too. Sing about the things that money couldn't replace. A janitor who had been cleaning nearby put down his mop and moved closer to listen. He had worked in this terminal for 15 years and had seen all kinds of performances by the public piano. Street musicians, talented kids, even a few famous people who wanted to show off. But he had never seen anything like this. This felt real in a way that made his chest tight with emotion. David's song continued. And now he was singing about the years that had passed since he and Lisa had said goodbye. He sang about building a company from nothing, about late nights and empty offices, about the moment when he realized he had everything he had thought he wanted, but felt more alone than ever. His voice cracked slightly as he sang about checking social media for glimpses of her life, but wondering if she was happy. She had found someone who deserved her in ways he never had. Lisa stepped even closer to the piano, close enough now that David could see the gold wedding ring on her finger. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow, but he kept singing, sang about happiness for her, about hoping she had found the love and stability he hadn't been able to give her when they were young and uncertain about everything. The crowd noticed the wedding ring too, and many people felt their hearts break a little. This wasn't going to be one of those fairy tale reunions where everything worked out perfectly. This was real life, complicated and messy, and full of choices that couldn't be undone. A college student who had been rushing to class found herself thinking about her own relationship. She and her boyfriend had been talking about graduation and the future, about job opportunities in different cities. Listening to David's song made her realize that some decisions carried weight that lasted decades, that the choices you made when you were young could echo through your entire life. The elderly music teacher was openly weeping now, not just because of the beauty of the performance, but because of its honesty. In her 40 years of teaching, she had tried to help her students understand that music wasn't just about notes and rhythm. It was about truth, about sharing the deepest parts of yourself with others. David was demonstrating that lesson better. than any textbook ever could. As his song reached its climax, David's voice grew stronger and more confident. He sang about gratitude for the time they had shared, about how loving her had taught him what it meant to be truly alive. He sang about carrying her with him through all the years and successes and failures, about how the memory of her smile had gotten him through some of his darkest moments. The teenage guitarist was watching David's hands on the piano keys, amazed at how he could play such complex music while singing with such raw emotion. This was what he wanted his own music to become someday. Not just technically impressive, but meaningful, connected to real human experience in ways that mattered. Police officers, who had come to check on the crowd, were standing at the edges, but making no move to disperse anyone. Even they could sense that something extraordinary was happening. Something that went beyond the usual rules about gatherings and noise levels. The terminal's security team was watching too, but they seemed to understand that this was one of those rare moments that needed to be allowed to happen. Social media posts about the performance were starting to spread, but they weren't the usual celebrity gossip or viral videos. People were sharing the moment with genuine emotion, talking about how the music had moved them, how it had made them think about their own lives and relationships. The hashtags weren't about David's wealth or fame, they were about love, memory, and the courage it took to be vulnerable in public. As David's song began to wind down, he looked directly at Lisa and sang the final verses. They were about letting go, about wishing someone well, even when it broke your heart, about finding peace in knowing that some love stories don't end with happily ever after, still matter more than anything else in the world. Lisa was crying, so hard now that her whole body was shaking. She mouthed thank you to David. And everyone watching could see that those two words carried the weight of 25 years of unspoken conversations. When the last note faded away, the terminal was completely silent for several long seconds. Then, starting slowly and building into something thunderous, the crowd began to applaud. But it wasn't the kind of applause you heard at concerts or performances. It was deeper than that, full of gratitude and respect for something genuine and brave and beautiful. David sat at the piano bench, emotionally drained, but somehow lighter than he had felt in years. He had shared his truth with the world, and the world had listened with kindness and understanding. As the applause continued, he realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just in his relationship with Lisa, but in his relationship with himself and the life he had built. As the applause slowly faded, David sat at the piano in complete silence, his hands resting on the keys. The emotional weight of what had just happened felt both crushing and liberating at the same time. He had just shared the deepest parts of his heart with hundreds of strangers, and somehow it felt like the most honest thing he had done in decades. Lisa was still standing there, tears still flowing, but now there was something different in her expression. Along with the sadness and the memories, there was also a kind of peace. She took a small step forward and placed her hand gently on the piano, close to where David's hands rested on the keys. "That was beautiful," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "I never forgot that song either." David looked up at her, and for a moment, they were both 22 years old again, sitting in their tiny apartment, dreaming about the future and believing that love could conquer anything. But they were also who they had become, middle-aged adults who had built lives and made choices and learned that some doors once closed couldn't be opened again. "I'm glad you're happy," David said simply. "I can see it in your eyes. You found what you were looking for." Lisa smiled through her tears. "I did, and you built something amazing too. I've followed your company over the years. I'm proud of what you accomplished." The teenager with the guitar had been listening to this quiet conversation, and something about it moved him deeply. Here were two people who had loved each other and lost each other, but who could still find joy in each other's happiness. He had never seen anything like it. Most of the breakups he knew about ended with anger or bitterness. This was different. This was what love looked like when it had grown up. David stood up from the piano bench and looked around at the crowd that was still gathered around them. These people had given him something precious: their attention, their respect, their willingness to witness his most vulnerable moment. He felt like he owed them something in return. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the terminal. "Thank you for listening." A woman near the back of the crowd called out, "Thank you for sharing that with us. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Other voices joined in, sharing their own thanks, their own appreciation for what they had witnessed. David realized that something extraordinary had happened here. In a world where people often felt disconnected and alone, music had created a moment of genuine human connection. The teenage guitarist stepped forward hesitantly. He was nervous about approaching someone so famous and successful, but something inside him said this was important. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say that your music inspired me. I've been playing for years, but I never understood what it could really do until I heard you play." David looked at the young man, really looked at him, and saw something that reminded him of himself at that age. The hunger for something meaningful, the desire to use music to touch people's lives. The hope that talent and hard work might lead somewhere special. "What's your name?" David asked. "Tommy," the teenager replied. "I play here sometimes to help my mom with expenses. She works really hard, but it's tough." David glanced over at Tommy's mother, who was watching the conversation with a mixture of pride and worry. He could see in her face the same look his own mother had worn when he was starting out. Love mixed with concern about whether dreams were enough to build a life on. "Tommy," David said, "would you play something for me? I'd like to hear what you can do." The crowd, which had been starting to disperse, gathered again as Tommy picked up his guitar. The young man was nervous now, knowing that he was about to perform for someone who had just demonstrated what real musicianship looked like. But as he started to play, something beautiful happened. Tommy's music was different from David's younger. Raw, but full of genuine emotion and surprising skill. He played a song he had written himself, about growing up in the city, about watching his mother work multiple jobs, about dreams that felt both possible and impossibly far away. David listened, with growing amazement. This kid had real talent, the kind that couldn't be taught or bought. But more than that, he had something even more valuable: authenticity. His music came from a real place, from real experiences and real emotions. When Tommy finished playing, David began to applaud, and the rest of the crowd joined in enthusiastically. The teenager's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire terminal. "Tommy," David said, "I want to ask you something. Do you have any interest in recording your music? In sharing it with a wider audience?" Tommy's eyes went wide. Yes, sir. That's always been my dream. But I don't know how to get started, and we can't afford ... One of David held up a hand gently. "What if I told you that wasn't something you needed to worry about anymore? What if I told you that sometimes, when something beautiful happens, it creates opportunities for even more beautiful things to happen?" Tommy's mother stepped forward, clearly overwhelmed by what was happening. "Sir, I don't know who you are exactly, but this is very kind of you. I just want to make sure my son understands that he needs to work hard for anything he gets." David smiled at her. "Ma'am, I can see that your son already understands the value of hard work, and I can promise you that what I'm offering isn't charity. It's an investment in something I believe in. Real talent deserves real opportunities." The businessman who had missed his train was watching this interaction with tears in his eyes. He was thinking about his own teenage daughter, about the dreams she had that he sometimes dismissed as impractical. Watching David recognize and nurture Tommy's talent was making him realize that maybe success wasn't just about making money. Maybe it was about lifting other people up along the way. The elderly music teacher pushed through the crowd again, this time approaching David directly. "I taught music for 40 years, she said. "And what you just did here today, both the performance and what you're doing for this young man, this is what music is really about. This is why it matters." David felt something shifting inside him, like a door opening that had been closed for years. For so long, his success had felt like something separate from who he really was. But standing here in this crowded terminal, surrounded by people who had been moved by his music, watching a talented teenager get a chance he might never have had otherwise, David felt like he was remembering who he had always meant to be. Lisa had been watching all of this with a warm smile. She said to David, "This is exactly what I would have expected from you. Even back in college, you always wanted to use music to help people. I'm glad you found your way back to that." The crowd finally began to disperse. People approached David and Tommy to share their thanks, their stories, their own dreams and struggles. The terminal had become an impromptu community, brought together by music and the courage of one man to be vulnerable in public. David exchanged contact information with Tommy and his mother, making plans to help the teenager record his music and connect with people in the industry who could guide his career. But more than that, he felt like he had rediscovered something essential about himself as he walked away from the piano. David realized that his monthly freedom days had just taken on a completely new meaning. He didn't just want to escape from his regular life anymore. He wanted to transform it, to find ways to use his success and resources to create more moments like this one. The viral videos of his performance would be shared millions of times over the following days, but for David, the real impact of what had happened wasn't about fame or publicity. It was about connection, about remembering that beneath all the business deals and board meetings and financial reports, life was really about the moments when people touched each other's lives in meaningful ways. And in the weeks and months that followed, David would find ways to make those moments happen more often, using his wealth and influence, not just to build companies, but to build bridges between people, to create opportunities for others to share their gifts with the world, and to remember that the most successful life was one that lifted others up along the way.